Hey everyone, welcome to the SIG Network Policy API subgroup meeting. Today is the 25th of February 2025. Let's all follow the Kubernetes Code of Conduct and be nice to each other. We have two items in the agenda. First up, Nadia, you want to take the floor?
Yes, I wanted to bring up the hopefully easier discussion part from the previous time and our API review just to see what's the best way forward. Maybe we just agree on some simple changes here. So one of the ideas there was that we need to combine ANP and BNP into the single object. And thanks, Sean, for opening all the issues for that, so we can actually track that and link all the enhancements to that. But basically, I was trying to summarize the idea is that we've discussed multiple word options, which I think naming is the most difficult part here anyway. But the general idea is that we could have an extra tier field, which would say whether that's ANP or BNP. That would mean where related to the network policy it is applied. So ANP means before network policy, BNP means after network policy. One thing I find kind of nice about that is let's say, as opposed to numbers, like if it was tier 1 and 2, ANP and BNP doesn't limit us in how many tiers we could have. Hopefully, we will not need too many in the future, but just in case we do, we could maybe introduce some more. And then another conversation was about changing priority word to something that's easier to understand. I think, again, based on our discussion, order was one of the most popular options, at least in that list. Maybe not the only one. So if you have other better ideas, please bring them up. And basically, what I'm trying to get to here is that for this, the evaluation order will look with this change potentially like this. So you will say tier ANP is evaluated first, and then order 1 means it's evaluated first, order 10 after that, order 45 is the last in this list. Then the network policy is evaluated, and then whatever we call like tier BNP, it also will have exactly the same spec, hopefully. So order meaning is exactly the same, but based on the tier, you know that it applies after network policy. Yeah, so that's the basic idea, I guess. Trying to figure out what's the easiest way to move forward. Should I just submit some pull requests with these changes, or maybe we will have more discussion about the naming or the idea itself?
How do we? Oh, sorry, Dan. I should have raised my hand. Go ahead, Dan.
Oh, I didn't know if we were raising hands or not. So this all looks good, except for there's been that conversation in the Slack channel that Bowie started, where we're starting to move towards, do we want to get rid of order and priority totally and just replace it all with tiers? And I think we probably need to resolve that discussion at the same time, because we don't want to design this and then have to redesign it.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think that was slightly orthogonal, just considering we are moving on with something similar to what we already have. And I think I did put that before I read the discussion, which makes sense. So yeah, maybe we just should postpone and not spend too much time on that before discussing that other point of changing how priorities work
together too. But yeah.
But I mean, actually, in general, I think all these things apply to what we are discussing, because I think the main difference there is the priority within the same admin network policy. So this priority or order will still apply, at least with current proposal that I saw. And basically just unifying this ANP and BNP also hopefully still applies. So does it actually affect this conversation, you think?
I mean, I guess we can have this conversation without worrying about that. But the final answer is going to end up being different, potentially.
Yeah.
So yeah, it doesn't need. I guess it doesn't need to block this, but we should probably be thinking about it. It might also help us make this better, if we know what we're doing with that as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe.
So
Blas, you have your hand raised.
yeah, so looking at this, let's call it diagram that you put here, the way that it would be ordered, if you add the priority that's implicit within the ingress and egress rules, you actually have a 3-layer priority list. So you have AMP versus NP versus BANP, then you have the order of the actual policies, and then you have the rules. So I think this description that you have here is slightly misleading because you have a second order, right? Which is what the discussion was about. And I think this is what kind of highlights the issue with the way AMP is designed right now. It's the complexity of it. So if you look as AMP as isolated just by itself, we might get away with it. But when you start looking at it the way you described it here, things seem very complex. I think a operator is going to have issues understanding exactly how their policies are being evaluated and the final outcome of their policies.
So do you mean that applies to the discussed changed or to this change, or if it applies to like the existing design? Because I think these like extra layers, they do exist right now. The only difference is that they just have different CRD names now versus being converted to this tier variable.
It doesn't really apply to the change. I think it's
In general.
likely another yeah, in general. But the way you listed it out here, I think highlights it well what the actual issue
Okay,
is.
I
Yeah.
see.
The question I had was around, so I think we are trying to completely combine AMP and BNP, right? So I guess this tier wouldn't exactly be called BNP. It would be like, I don't know, AMP at some tier. Like, how do we tell which tier is before which tier?
Yeah, exactly. We'll need to come up with some names, I think. And as I try to address, like you could use numbers, but that kind of limits the
The
extra,
hierarchy that
the extra things you could insert in the future. So when you just have some words and then you explain the meanings, yeah, as Dan suggests, maybe override, baseline. That's another fun naming conversation, I guess. Here I just try to show how the current CRDs would be mapped.
Yeah. No, I mean, it makes sense. It's just when you put it AMP and BNP, it completely throws it off.
Yeah, considering it
And
is
then
called admin network policy, yeah.
Yeah. No, and then the order 3 is at this position and the order 1 is in the other position, and then it's like, oh, BNP with order 3. I mean, I think we should change also the way I have to change the way we think, because it's not really BNP at order 3. It's non-overridable something at that priority, right? Like the priority in this sense makes it's not relevant. Let me put it this way. Let me not even call it priority. The order will be relevant only after the tier hierarchy, just like we have today, but on a different sense. And then we have the third level of precedence within the rules, which is what Blas was saying.
So really this, there's two things here, I think. One is the reason for why we actually want to get rid of baseline admin network policy Maya constraints, so that we don't have two different objects needlessly, that we limit the number of objects we're creating. But the other is the priority. So this is a third level prioritization now, and really what it selects is whether the admin network policy is evaluated before or after the network policies. So maybe we should name it in line with that, say before or after, or something like that.
Right, before
that would make it
and
more
after is kind of dual, but yeah, I mean the naming conversation will totally have to happen, I guess. Maybe in the enhancement proposal if we come up with one. Otherwise, it may take all the time we have. Yeah, I mean we could totally come up with better names. I guess at this point, I'm mostly wondering if that proposal in general makes sense, but also I think it is reasonable maybe to wait until we figure something out about the general design changes, whether we want to do them or not, before I try to actually make an enhancement proposal out of this. Or I mean, I could still do that and we could have these conversations in parallel. Not sure which way is better.
I mean, if you're voting, I'm in favor of fewer CRDs rather than more. There's already too many.
Yeah.
And I think yes, nailing down both what this tier or whatever it is going to be, and then whether we want to get rid of the third tier of priorities. I think those two things, or those things, are all important because they tie into each other.
The other thing I wanted to ask was, are we also proposing that we will have more, well, there is no more BANP, right? So let me put it this way. Are we also proposing that in any tier you can have any number of policies? For lack of a better way of putting it. Like we're gonna remove the
do we
restriction
have-
of no more one
yeah.
baseline, right?
Yeah.
I think that was the suggestion from Tim, was just to say, yeah, it's not going to last very long having that restriction.
Yes.
He thought it would get chipped away and then we'd end up having to do it anyway, and then the two CRDs would end up the same.
Yeah. Do we want to combine all that in the same NPEP, or maybe it makes sense given we're trying to?
Yeah, I would
I
say
think
maybe.
we're forced to. I think we're forced to deal with that, because if you have a baseline, if you combine the two CRDs, then you're going to have a priority field or an order field in the CRD.
Yeah.
So you have to say what happens to it in the baseline ones. So we should probably do that in the same one.
Yeah.
I think we're effectively just getting rid of baseline network policy and making the admin network policy be more flexible so that it can be used instead. That's how I would look at it. Instead of saying, well, we are enhancing baseline network policy or limiting some restrictions, we are just literally getting rid of it and replacing it with admin network policy.
Right. And what about the pass in the CR itself? Is that going to be available to that tier? I'm not going to call this tier the baseline tier also, but it just doesn't mean anything at that point. Like, we don't, it's the same as not having anything below.
I think we have that kind of issue in Calico, because there always has to be a last tier in your list of tiers, and we have tiered policy, and we just say that a pass in the final tier jumps to the default action that you would have had if you didn't hit that tier at all. So it's kind of, you have to define something for it to do, but
And
but,
by default
yeah,
action, you mean it would be an allow if you didn't have anything, but then if you did have some other mechanism in your cluster, it would be that, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I think in Kubernetes, if you're not using any vendor specific stuff, then if you did a pass action, we would jump to the default allow rule that Kubernetes has.
Yeah, you can also look at that as if pass is a kind of a go-to. So basically you pass all the BNPs and then, well, there is nothing left at the end. So it's the same as if some traffic didn't match anything. No admin network policies, no network policies, no baseline network policies. That's kind of similar to what pass action does. Just keeps all the following BNPs.
It will probably make sense to just specify in the CRD explicitly, or in the comments, mention that a pass in the baseline network policy is effectively an off, or passes to the default, which is, it needs to be explicitly documented. So let's not assume that it will be obvious what pass means in the lowest tier.
I think that would be a sensible thing to write down.
Yeah, especially because I think the original use case had this word delegate, allows administrators to delegate to something, but it still means delegation, like you said, to something default. But yeah, I'm sure we'll also document it as part of the info. Write that down. Oh, Somebody's helping me with notes. Thank you.
That's me, sorry.
No, all good. Thank you.
Typing across here.
Is there any other, let's say, difference between the two? I haven't checked field by field, but do we see anything similar to pass that is present in ANP today and not in PANP? Or are we almost similar with everything else?
Yeah, I need to double check. I think I did that comparison for tenancy discussion, and I think it was priority and pass were the only two things.
Yeah, I can't remember anything else either. Singleton, priority, and yeah. Okay, looks like we have a general consensus on this in general. And one last point of discussion, are we considering this as a blocker for before we move to beta? In changing this, I assume yes, or I don't know.
Yeah, that's a big change.
Yes. Most definitely.
I mean, we can't change this within a beta. So if we went to beta and then did this, we would have to do a beta 2.
Yeah. Yeah, the reason I asked was mainly also for other implementations. Well, Sean, for Calico, did you implement the current API as, let's say, it's not still GA kind of a thing?
Yeah, so we've got, I can't remember exactly which version of the CRDs we've embedded. I think you mentioned to me earlier that there was a new version of the CRDs coming that had different annotations on them, just in terms of what we said we were supporting, but we haven't worried too much about that yet. And changing this stuff is fairly straightforward for us.
But actually, we should probably change this to V1 Alpha 2 at this point, given that there are people using the V1 Alpha 1 API, and this would be an incompatible change.
Right.
Yeah.
I would prefer at least like a proper release before we do this, but I think we're still starting on the NPEP, so it will still take us some time.
You're saying you'd like another release of V1 Alpha 1 with the latest changes before
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I know we also do this the patch releases, but I don't think we've been regular, and I think that was blocked on the API review, so we're back to that square one. So I think what we need to do is to get the current API kind of approved in some sense of paperwork done, and then we do a final release in the current form, and then we do another beta V1, something like that.
That sounds right.
Okay.
Trying to write that down. I don't know. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, we want another alpha V1 release with the current state. Yeah, introduce changes as V1 alpha 2, and then that sounds good. Thank you. Okay, I think we're good on that topic. Anybody else wants to add anything before we move to what should we rename the priority field to? Oh, and I think the consensus was open and end, I can go from there, right? Now, did you say you are going to, or not? Oh, no,
yeah, I volunteered myself.
Very good. Okay, rename priority to what? I think we all agree that it's confusing. Calico calls it order. And there are some alternatives. Should we ask AI for help?
I did.
It seems
That's where some of the
order
alternatives came from.
Order seems to make sense because really what it's specifying is the order in which the rules are being evaluated. The only issue with naming of this is what does a low number mean and what does a high number mean, right? So order itself, the word is intuitive, but the number that's being specified really isn't. I think that's about it. But otherwise, I'm in favor of order.
Yeah, and that's something as we've discussed, I'll include to that and PEP trying to merge ANP and BNP. At this point, I don't think I've heard any better options than order, even if it's not perfect. But yeah, we could also have this extra discussion there in the NPAP.
But I guess to answer my own question about the numbers, if you think that you are in a queue and you're waiting, whoever is the first in the queue goes first, right? So that's the order. So the lower number means you go first. So maybe it's not that unintuitive. So.
Maybe we should make the field a string, and you have to write first, second, third.
Yay!
I mean, if you don't like our naming, make up your own.
I don't think there's a silver bullet here. Priority has the problem that we know. I still find that we did a lot of bike shedding about should it be priority, should it be order, should it be something else, way back when, and I still find users talk about priority and they'll say a high priority thing, and then they have to translate that into a low order. But it's the same if you have priority. They would talk about a high priority thing, but they would be talking about a low number, and it doesn't matter if you flip that around because you get as many people thinking about it in both ways. So that's my experience anyway, and they just have to learn the convention. I think making it order, maybe it helps because it's different. You have to think about it a little bit rather than priority, which you could guess either way. But yeah.
I just did a quick search, and one of the most common syntaxes that people or network engineers are used to is Cisco, and they call it a sequence number. So, but it's evaluated the same as how we suggest to be of order to be used. I don't want to derail the discussion by adding yet another option. I was curious how other implementations are calling it.
I think so. Some of the other, I didn't have sequence number on the list. That one didn't come up, but I'd suggested sort order or priority order in the issue. But yeah, I don't. It's hard to argue that any of them is better.
Yeah, they seem more confusing. Sequence, yeah. I think order is the best of the options that you have.
Nadia, you had your hand raised. Do you know what it?
Yeah, I've just been thinking that that's something that would be nice also to add there. When you have priority, you say, okay, I have ANP with a higher priority and with a lower priority. So what adjective do you use with the order? Do you say lower order?
First order and second order.
Right, but what if it's not? What if it's not first, but just relative?
I mean, you do. If you use the word order, you do have to say lower order, meaning earlier order, later order. Yeah.
Right, because I think that aligns better with the number being lower and the order being lower, which is the problem with priority, which is vice versa.
I think the answer may be that you try to avoid talking about it in that way. You just say that the policies are evaluated in numerical order according to the order field, and don't talk about higher or lower or.
Yeah.
Right, but if you're trying to present this, as like we've done before, and you're
Right, but
trying
that's what I'm
to
saying.
explain why something is applied first.
You rephrase it. You say that they're applied in order, and so that means that 1 is applied first and 10 is applied after that.
Okay.
Wait,
well, yeah.
Where what applied in order according to the order, right? Like, it's not like there is an invisible line for each policy. in this case. So the fact
we'll
that
have to
order
set an
10
example.
policy will be evaluated. Well, actually, I find this more confusing. The fact that order 10 policy will be evaluated before order 3 policy. If we ever think that one is like 1,
But
2, and
they
3
are
are
on
the
different tiers. Or
Yeah,
whatever we
but
call them.
I can sense almost a confusion there on why my 45 was evaluated before my 3.
Imagine how confused you will be when you realize that you also have the rules are ordered, right? So that was exactly the point when we were discussing the fact that we now have effectively 3 layers of priority or 3 layers of order. Do you call them the same thing? Are they all order? In what order is the order evaluated?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I was kind of assuming that this is not the final NPEP that Nadia will, transform it into something more beautiful where, I don't know, we'll probably block out an order for the tiers, but that will also restrict the block we have. But that's something to think about.
so one question. I mean, we are on naming right now. One thing that just occurred to me regarding the previous discussion around the base admin network policy so the proposal is that the tier would apply to the entire spec. So you specify the tier on the spec. How about specifying the tier on the rules?
But that doesn't quite work with the order, right? So that's
Yeah,
the
that-
point. So basically, tier and order gives you where your policy lies in this sandwich.
I mean, you could specify that order less than X or order 0 is baseline policy, something like that. So, or maybe if order is not specified, then it's baseline policy or something like that. That
Yeah,
would
that's another thing I think
partially
we've
remove the
discussed
confusion. Yeah.
and figured out that it may be actually even more confusing because you will likely either have to set some order to be the network policy, which is the separator between admin network policy and baseline network policy, or you will have to set it to 0 and use like negative numbers for that priority, which makes it more complicated. So then -2 is evaluated before 0 or something.
So then if we are discussing naming, then and we seem to be converging on this priority to be renamed to order, then what should we call the tier? let's settle the naming if we're already on this topic.
I think that it just can be difficult to settle up on the naming. It's always long discussions. That's why I'm just trying to figure out if the general idea makes sense, and then I want to create the NPEP for the naming discussion because I know it could just last longer. If
Okay,
that makes sense.
sounds good. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can rehash and iterate over on the NPEP. And does this help with tenancy in that case? Because it
Yes, I think somewhat. I mean, it doesn't solve everything, but it does help a little bit. But it's a bit too early to
the whole
celebrate.
priority for baseline part, I think that was the biggest block you had. right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. Because now you can use the basically the ANP as a tenancy kind of type and just steal the order from it and use it for the tenancy. Again, can't say whether that's going to be the chosen way forward, but yeah, I hope that at least having one CRD will definitely make tenancy easier, no matter what we decide.
Yeah, I think that sounds good. And also makes things more simpler, I think, with just one CRD. Okay, any other topics or anything to add for the rename priority discussion? I think we're all generally agreeing on, most of us thumbs up the order, but then we'll take a final call on the NPEP. Is it all in the same NPEP? I guess yes, because it's all being discussed together, right? Anyways, we have to
Yeah, we
expand
can-
on.
Let's just combine those two into one
Yeah.
proposal.
it's-
Probably went
just wanted to
went
ask since
overboard
it's two
having two
different
issues.
Yeah, agree. Thanks, Sean.
Yeah, I guess the only other thing that we could potentially discuss is that Slack thread when Bowie suggested some potential changes to the priority. Yeah, I don't know what's the best way for us to move forward with that discussion, though, so that we can have some consensus somewhat quicker?
I think the answer or the question that we should try to answer is, what is the reason that admin and network policy is currently designed the way it is? If there's a good reason for it, then there's no reason to change it. I think we all agree that the current implementation is relatively complex to understand, but if there's a purpose behind it that we can justify, then it should be like that, right? So it
I don't
seems
think I
like
agree that it's complex to understand. It was kind of the natural way for me to think about it, coming from my background working with Calico, because it's similar to our model. And we have tiered policy, and once people get the idea of, you know, tiers being groups of policy where you kind of go from one to the next, it kind of slots into place for most people. I think most like routers and firewalls and things have primitives based on list of rules that are executed in order. IP tables, NF tables being the Linux examples, and lots of Cisco kit and various other bits of kit that do bags of rules ordered.
Yeah.
I
Also, almost
think
all
it's
firewalls.
a really common thing that's already out there. So it was the thing that occurred to us, I think, is the
yeah, I don't think anyone is arguing that order is something that's complex, but the fact that we're not going to have effectively 3 layers of order, that is not that common. So if you look at a typical, let's say, Cisco access list, it's just one number, and that's it. And the rules are related in that order, and it's relatively easy to understand. Here it gets more complex, and you actually have to, if you're not intimately familiar with how admin network policy works, you have to look it up before you understand it. And it can make it, especially the fact that you have now the network policy squeezed in between, it's kind of confusing. I do see an issue though. Like in theory, we could make the ingress rule, instead of it being an array, it could just be a single field. Then that would diverge from how network policy does it. And I understand why admin network policy is designed the way it is designed. I'm not really sure that there are use cases for all this complexity.
So-
Is
Dan,
there?
you have your
Yeah,
hand raised, Roland.
one thing you were saying before, you know, if we have a good reason for the design, then okay, let's go with the design and we don't have to worry about it. And after the discussion with Bowie, I'm not totally sure that that is true, because we have this weirdness where you can say with priority 100 accept this packet, and with priority 100 drop this packet. You know, you can request that the cluster do 2 contradictory things at the same time. And I've been trying to think of another API in Kubernetes that lets you do that, and I haven't been able to come up with anything. So, you know, API reviewers may argue that this is, you know, inherently un-Kubernetes like, that we allow the user to ask for something impossible and contradictory. So
I guess one solution to this is to simply prohibit 2 policies with the same priority.
which you also can't do. You know, validation cannot look at other objects when deciding whether or not to accept an object. That is also non-Kubernetes like, and probably would not be accepted by API review. So
unless you encode the priority in the name, I suppose, but
right.
that's probably not something we want to do.
So I mean, so I think it is worth thinking about if, you know, so of course the reason why we have priority is because we want to support multiple objects, and we want each object to be able to have both allow and deny rules, and therefore you need to be able to just you know, figure out which rule is going to be evaluated first. And maybe if we thought about it some more, we could figure out a different way to get the same functionality without having an API that lets people come up with contradictory things. but I don't know.
But why do we need different objects? I mean, the ingress and egress rules themselves have
Because, and I mean, for one, forcing things to be singletons is also non-Kubernetes like. But you want people to be able to create independent little objects that each do one thing. Here is the admin network policy that enforces this policy for me, and here's the admin network policy that enforces this one. And you want maybe you don't, but we had talked about you want third-party software to be able to install its own admin network policies with the things that it needs to care about.
There is also no easy way to do that because you want multiple pod selectors, which are not peers, but like local pods that the policy applies to. And then if you try to put all the possible local pods and all the peers in the same object, it will just grow to some crazy long object. And again, it will be much more difficult to manage.
I think kind of echoing what Dan said, I see a lot of value in being able to have a policy that is a kind of a unit of thought of, I want to do this stuff to this group of traffic coming in or out of this set of pods. So I want to allow traffic to this, block traffic to things over here, and then pass traffic over here. And it kind of, those three things kind of join together into a particular goal that you're trying to achieve. So it's kind of natural to put them in one object. And then you have lots of different admin network policies that are doing different things. And if you only have like one type of allow or deny or pass in a particular policy, like I think was one of the suggestions Boe had, then you end up with those being split into multiple different policies, which felt a bit unnatural to me. Yeah, also second that there could be, you may in aggregate have thousands of rules, and you don't want to put them all in one object, and they come from different sources, they're built by different teams, they apply to different products that you're running on your Kubernetes cluster. So for admin maintainability purposes, you want them to be split into different objects, not one big one.
Yeah, that sounds like a very good justification to me. It seems like the highest priority issue that we should try to resolve is the ambiguity of two policies with the same priority / order. Because
Did we discuss the whole option of coming up with a way to make, was it a status that we thought we would do? I thought we discussed this in the last meeting or the meeting before.
Yeah, status events.
Yeah, but the question is, does that even, like, once you get to the point where you have the two contradicting policies, like, you have a problem.
Yeah.
And have we already failed the user at that point, essentially, by giving them an API that lets them mess up like that?
Yeah, I think we have. Do we have an issue already for this that Boe created?
I don't think so. No, he made a Google Doc.
When we've looked at it before, if you want to resolve those things, you're kind of forced in one of a few directions. Like the way we've specified the rules and the match criteria at the moment, you can name the same pods in different ways. So there's no good way of like saying, do these two rules like conflict. I mean, Dan's made this point a few times, but you might have one rule that matches on one label and one rule that matches on a different label, and you can't tell if they conflict without checking if there's any pods that have that same label, like right now at this instant, and then tomorrow there might be a pod that have have the two
Mm.
different labels, and and all of a sudden your rules conflict when they didn't before. It's a kind of very dynamic property. You could have a cider match as well in your rule that matches the pods. And I think we explicitly said domain rules couldn't match pods, but you have different ways of
Yeah.
naming the same thing, and the implementations under the covers are all going to be different. So actually telling whether you have a conflict is hard. So you either need to define some rule that gives you like a strict order for all of the rules in all of the admin network policies, or you need some tiebreaker rule that that is more flexible, or something else.
Nadia?
Yeah, so I think there are two slightly different kind of problems here. One is the undefined behavior, as we've tried to discuss that, and that could be potentially solved, as Sean says, like by trying to add some extra ordering or whatever. But another thing is like that we allow users to create these conflicting configurations. I think that is also a problem of network policy, for example. So even if you have two different network policies allowing traffic to the same pod, I'm not sure whether that's a correct configuration or not. Because, I mean, why do you have two separate things defining what happens to the same flow? I mean, even though that's not a quote unquote conflict, it also looks somewhat strange, like a misconfiguration potentially.
Well,
So like in that network policy, you just have a chance of saying allow and deny for the same priority. But is it actually very different?
with network policy, it's easier because it's additive. With admin network policy, you have allow, deny, and pass. So I think where it gets difficult is when you have two rules with the same priority referring to the same pod, but one says deny and the other says allow. What do you do?
Yeah, that's
That's-
exactly what I'm talking about. But is it
Yeah.
more of a misconfiguration than having two separate network policies? Or let's say if we had admin network policy that is sorted by action, and you have two separate admin network policy, both saying like allow to this pod. Is it the correct configuration though?
I mean, you can argue that it's a misconfiguration, but we were earlier. I think Sean was describing why the way admin network policy is designed is good. That you can have multiple network policies because multiple people are trying to describe the policy for different things, so they are effectively working independently from each other. Each of them works on their own policy. So then, when you combine them all, you get a mess. If you assume that it's a single person, then you can say, yes, that person made a mistake specifying an invalid policy. But when you have multiple people working together, such conflicts are inevitable. So the fact that the design allows this is a bug.
Nathan has your hand raised for a long time. So,
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that two overlapping allow policies have the virtue of at least being idempotent. And this is something that you especially see in multi-tenant clusters where there might be some like global policy matching all selectors that allows DNS, but independent teams might not even know if that policy exists or not. So I do think there is a big difference between two objects creating the exact same functionality and two objects which conflict in their end state.
Right, but in the network policy world, right, deny is implicit. So when you just don't have an allow rule for something, you could expect that it is actually denied, even though it could be allowed, let's say, by another network policy. So just the fact, I see how it's not non-contradictory and you just have a defined behavior and you know what to do, but it doesn't mean that someone else didn't create another object hoping that there will be a different action, let's say.
I mean, but you're just saying plain network policy is terrible, which, I mean, you can't understand the behavior of a single network policy in isolation without knowing what other network policies are also there. And that's bad design in network policy, but I don't think that says anything about the question of whether to allow rules or to deny rules for the same target are good or bad.
Right. So, okay, I guess that goes just to the point where you cannot, if you have more than one object, you actually, even if you have just one ad network policy, you cannot guarantee that there is no rule that will apply to the same connection. Two different rules that apply to the same connection. And as soon as you have them, what I'm saying is it doesn't quite matter whether the action is different or the same. Just having two different rules applying to the same traffic could be kind of contradictory, and different people could mean something different by that, which is a misconfiguration by itself.
How can two allows mean something different?
Because no network policy says allow. It says allow this and deny everything else, right? So like if you have one policy that says allow from A to B and another policy that says allow from B to A, it's possible that two different people created those policies and each one of them only wanted traffic to be allowed in one direction and wanted it to be implicitly denied in the other direction.
Same could apply to A and P. You could have two rules saying allow this selector and then deny all. So what you're saying, as long as this first selector doesn't work, it should be denied by your policy. So let's say you update it and it's not allowed anymore, but it is kind of still allowed by something else. So it's still like two different actors, potentially, or two different rules trying to say what to do with the same traffic.
Couldn't you say this about any API object in Kubernetes? I mean, couldn't you, in theory, create two deployment sets that reference the exact same image? And like are meant to do the same thing, but accidentally are deployed by two different teams?
They do not affect each other though, right? As long as you delete your own deployment, it's not there anymore. And you're not quite bothered by the fact that there is another deployment with the same image in the same cluster.
Maybe.
I mean, certainly all APIs allow the user to accidentally do something other than what they wanted. But they don't usually allow the user to explicitly request that the system do two different contradictory things.
Even arguing that other policies might have design issues, that doesn't mean that admin network policy should have it too. I mean, the fact that we know that there is a problem means we should try to resolve it. What I'm thinking is when you're creating, so the core issue here is that we cannot prevent the user creating two policies with the same priority / order. That seems like a lack of functionality in Kubernetes. So perhaps we should decide that priority should be unique and that there needs to be an enhancement to Kubernetes to allow validation of objects based on an arbitrary field that has to be unique. I mean, it kind of already exists because you can create two policies with the same name. So it's basically the same thing. It's just at a different layer that the checks are being enforced. So just the fact that Kubernetes doesn't have some functionality doesn't mean that we should not ask it to be added.
We
So,
did.
my point is we've identified an issue in Kubernetes, right? Because we've seen that this problem exists across other APIs, right? Maybe the problem should be, underlying problem should be solved.
So getting back, I just want to summarize the outcome for this one. That where I started is that we're trying to discuss, like, or at least try to discuss slightly separate problems. So the misconfiguration itself sounds like it could happen anyway, as long as you have more than one A and P. But what we are actually trying to solve is these contradictory actions being requested for that. Do we all agree with that?
Yeah, because this had come up before as well in some of the discussion. It's always possible for the administrator to accidentally create two policies that, where they thought the other one had priority 100, so they gave this one priority 200, but it turns out the other one actually had priority 300, and so now the end result is doing
Yeah,
it.
exactly.
That's always possible. So yeah, the real
Okay, yeah, that's what I wanted to just sum up on. And now, Sean, please continue.
I think we did kick around the idea of, what if we could make the order unique? I think there's kind of awkwardness to doing that because you might have a bunch of different people creating these things and they might be using, automation and GitOps and stuff to create their stuff. And if it just feels very restrictive to me to not be able to create a bunch of things at priority 100 that are all doing kind of the same thing, and you've thought about your policy layout, and you don't want to have to manage, all of our priority 100 to 200 things, they all have to have unique priorities, so we're going to go through and number them and then keep track of which numbers are free and that kind of thing. That feels quite restrictive on the admin. I just think it would be frustrating. But it does solve the problem. But it might actually be frustrating in use, was what I was worried.
I think it forces you to think about the order in which your policies are being evaluated, which I would argue is a good thing. Although yes, there is some overhead. I don't think the fact that you need to order the priorities or they need to discuss who's going to use what priority is such a big burden on the admins. I mean, you can decide that ranges from 100 to 200 are used by team or person A, the other ranges are used by someone else if you want to resolve it like that. But the fact that conflicts are detected when you try to apply a policy, I would argue is a good thing, not a bad thing.
So I think we are reaching time. We only have 4 minutes left. Does anybody think that it's a good idea to actually reach out to the API server team to hear their thoughts, and maybe they have a different way or different idea suggestion for the API machinery team? Or at least I know the first action item was to ask Kowe or one of us to go and create an upstream issue, follow it up. But I think maybe we can explore. I know we've spoken about this topic a few times within this subgroup, but maybe exploring options with other communities might give us new ideas.
I mean, I propose the idea, so I'm in favor.
Okay, let's see what we can write down here. Open an upstream to practice and start a thread with.
It seems like we don't have any alternatives. Alternative is to leave the status quo, or explore an option to check for uniqueness of priority or order.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't even like that was not the only option I was thinking. Like with regards to let's restrict the order to be unique. I was just in general thinking maybe there's a different way we could implement order in the API, but I don't know. I'm sorry, I think I spoke over you, Nadia.
No, just I was thinking if it makes sense to also create like a document or enhancement, just trying to list all the possible options. If we just agree that they do not make any sense, that sounds like that could be useful in the future when we forget again why we decided one way or the other. I'm not sure if there is any good way, perfect in every way to solve this problem. So maybe if just having a list of all the solutions we could think of, and then why we didn't like some of them.
And having that before going and talking to API machinery would probably help that conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Maybe we can just open an NPEP that outlines the problems, that outlines the different options, why those don't work. And then we can just link that PR, which they can review on their own time, and that would save their time also. Because I think the API is complicated to explain. Okay, I think that sounds like a good action item. We have 2 minutes left. Anybody wants to bring up anything else? Oh, who's coming to KubeCon London in this group? I know Nadia is coming, Dan's coming, Sean, Nathan.
I'm coming.
Lars.
Yeah, I'm local.
Yeah, that's awesome. Nathan, Lars?
That's how.
Sorry, to KubeCon?
Yeah,
No.
okay. We can try to do a meeting, maybe. With whoever is coming like we do usually, but we still have time to figure it out. Okay, sounds good. Thanks all for joining. See you again in 2 weeks. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.